Welcome to the Peak Endurance Podcast. Episode 119 is an interview with Louise Burke. Louise is a sports dietitian with 40 years of experience in the education and counselling of elite athletes. She worked at the Australian Institute of Sport for 30 years, first as head of sports nutrition and then as chief of nutrition strategy. She was the team dietitian for the Australian Olympic teams for the 1996 to 2012 Summer Olympic Games. Her publications include over 350 papers in peer-reviewed journals and book chapters, and the authorship or editorship of several textbooks on sports nutrition. She is an editor of the International Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism. Louise was a founding member of the Executive of Sports Dietitians Australia and is a director of the IOC Diploma in Sports Nutrition. She was awarded a Medal of the Order of Australia in 2009 for her contribution to sports nutrition. Louise was appointed as Chair in Sports Nutrition in the Mary MacKillop Institute of Health Research at the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne in 2014 and took up this position in a full-time capacity in 2020. Personally, I've been a fan of Louise's ever since I was a cyclist, which was forever ago, and read her book, The Complete Guide to Food for Sports Performance. That is where I started to develop my love of all things nutrition, especially when it relates to performance. I find this episode chat so incredibly informative. I really hope you do too. And as I always say, if you do enjoy this episode, please go on over to Apple Podcasts to rate, review, and subscribe. And right here on YouTube too. I would really appreciate it as it helps grow the audience and the show. And of course, I love reading your feedback and I just love your support. Are injuries or niggles ruining your enjoyment of running and hindering your performance? Get on top of these and see the specialists at Health and High Performance. Utilising the latest in technology and with an absolute wealth of experience, the team at Health and High Performance can assist you with all your running injury and performance needs. So, to get back to enjoying your running and achieving the results you are capable of, head to healthhp.com.au/run or find them on Instagram, Health High Performance. Health and High Performance are located in Mont Albert, Melbourne, but they are available for telehealth appointments not only Australia-wide but also around the world. Contact them on their website to find out more. Wild Earth Australia are the online store to help you make the most of the outdoors with top quality gear at great prices. Peak Endurance podcast listeners can use the discount code Peak Endurance, which is all capitals, to get 10% off at checkout. Head on over to wildearth.com.au to get everything you need for your next grand adventure. If you want to be the best athlete you can be, you deserve the best coaching you can get. Peak Endurance Coaching has a personal touch you won't get elsewhere that will help you achieve your running goals with customized plans that reflect your commitments in life and your athletic history. You will become fitter, faster, and stronger whilst becoming part of the Peak Endurance Coaching community. Don't waste a minute of your running journey. Email me, Isabel, at peakendurancecoaching.com.au to get a program designed just for you started. Enjoy this incredibly informative chat with Louise. I learned so much and I hope you do too. You know, on a different level, but it's still important. And I'm sure it has repercussions for other health, modalities as well, no doubt.
Yeah, this is one of the interesting things to see. My husband is a researcher and he's more into the health angle, although he's been involved in sport also. But over the years, we've been able to do more collaborative work where something that we're interested in that we can study with athletes and have them amplifying an issue that we're wanting to investigate. And then once we've got the results, then we can apply it to the community. And some of our most important papers or some of the activities that we've done that get most highly cited are around this idea of protein spread over the day and how much protein you might need if you're in energy deficit, so when you're trying to lose weight. Now these are these are some research projects that we did at the AIS, and we used resistance-trained athletes to find the results. But those have been then turned into recommendations of how we might feed elderly or ageing populations, and particularly to try and make them aware of the importance of exercise and strategic nutrition around it, so that we can help either reverse or prevent sarcopenia and some of sarcopenia and some of the diseases of modern society. So there's nice ways in which we've been able to show, yes, that what elite athletes want to know also has a message for the community, and elite athletes can help find those answers more quickly. So then we've got the information to use for a greater community benefit.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, that's really good. And protein, that's a really interesting topic too. But there's so much. I mean, I'm obviously not a dietitian or anything remotely like that, but it just really interests me, and that's why I wanted you on the podcast, because I know that you are like a world leader on this topic, and I was looking in and you were talking about that your lecturer who was carb depleting, obviously, to carb load. And I was reading in your article, Contemporary Nutrition Strategies to Optimize Performance in Distance Runners and Race Walkers, that race preparation should include strategies to store muscle glycogen. Carbohydrate loading has fallen out of favor over the years. And I'm an ultra runner, an ultra runner coach, and I know a lot of people don't carbo load, and a lot of coaches don't, that they say not to. But then you talk about the contemporary carbohydrate loading protocol is an abbreviated version of the original one. Can you tell us a bit more about that, and whether you think people should do some form of carbohydrate loading before an event, especially ultramarathon, which is often, 6, 7, 8 or more hours?
Sure. So I think there's two different aspects to this. And the first is that when we start learning about something and we simplify the message, sometimes we then make it a wrong message. And so when sports nutrition started to get some publicity behind it, the message about carbohydrate being so important and sort of been then translated into this idea that everybody should eat lots of carbohydrates all the time, regardless of what their goals were, became a message that sounded good, but we now know that that's really an oversimplification, and it's in many cases not the right message for people. So we've had to then reorganise what we mean by eating enough carbohydrate. So we now talk about it as being high carbohydrate availability, meaning that you're matching your intake with the fuel requirements of the exercise that you do. That's going to differ from athlete to athlete, but it's also going to differ in the same athlete from day to day, because athletes have, hard training days, and they have training, or rest days where there's very low requirements. So we now are more comfortable with this idea that you can eat more or less carbohydrate and still be doing the right thing in terms of fueling your muscle. Now, the second part of the issue is that we now know that in some sports, athletes compete in events which have a duration or an intensity that's larger than the amount of muscle glycogen that's normally stored. And so in those sports, to try and get that high carbohydrate availability to support optimal performance, we need to have ways of making the muscle better able to store glycogen and or take in extra carbohydrate during the event. So that first part of storing glycogen is the carbohydrate loading issue. And we've changed our understanding of what's needed to do that, because the original studies that were undertaken in Scandinavia in the 1960s were done in essentially untrained people. Most Scandinavians are healthy, recreationally exercising people. And so they brought to the table muscles that were somewhat prepared to be able to store glycogen, but not to the same degree as our very highly trained athletes. So in lesser trained people, you have to do a lot more work to get the muscle to be able to store lots of glycogen. And that involved this very not complicated, but it was a week-long event that really required some commitment. So you had to start off by doing some long exercise to deplete the muscle glycogen, and then have a couple of days of keeping it low by having a low carbohydrate diet and continuing to train. And then when you switched to 3 days of high carbohydrate eating and started to taper the training, you've got that overcompensation in glycogen storage, leading you to be able to go into your race with higher glycogen stores. So that worked really well for that population, but more research down the track was able to show that in highly trained athletes, a lot of that process is unnecessary because that's what their training has done for them already. And so with sort of highly trained marathon runners or race walkers or ultramarathoners or Ironman triathletes, there's just some of the people that would benefit from having optimised glycogen stores prior to the event. Just probably 48 hours of tapered training and upping the carbohydrate intake is enough to maximise glycogen stores. So that's probably what we do now. Some of our athletes heading over to the Olympics will be doing something like that for their events. The other little twist that we might put on it, and this is what I certainly do with the athletes I work with, is to have a low residue diet for the 72 hours before the race, because what you're wanting to do then is to take into account that carbohydrate loading is going to store extra glycogen and water, and that means that there's going to be an increase in body mass as a result. And you know, when you're at the start of a marathon or a race walking event or a cycling event, riding up a hill, you want to be as light as possible. And so even that sort of extra kilo and a half of weight, if you can find a way to counteract that, then that's helpful. And so the low residue diet means that we can strip all the fibre out of the gut and reduce the weight of the contents. But the other thing it's also useful for is that no runner wants to be caught short at the marathon start where they suddenly have to find the porta potty. If you can empty your gut of fibre so that you don't have to do the number 2 on the morning, or you can at least know it's going to be a small one, that's really helpful at the race line, just to help some of the gastrointestinal challenges around the event. So our carbohydrate loading protocol probably still goes for that 3 days prior to the event, although some of it's about going to the low residue form of eating, and then as we get closer
by low residue, do you mean low fibre?
Yeah, low fibre. So it really is stripping out all the vegetables and fruit and the fibre content of that. We still have some, but you can have very well cooked soft vegetables that are all mashed up that you can reduce the fibre content, and certainly using white cereals so that all the sort of the healthy side of eating around the whole grains now is sacrificed for a couple of days just to get ready for the event.
Yeah. And that makes sense because there's nothing worse than standing on the starting line, and that's what's occupying your mind.
Yes.
Now, for a marathon, it's recommended to consume during the race between 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. Would you extrapolate that recommendation for ultramarathons as well, or would it change?
Well, look, it depends a lot on what you are as an athlete. So, in fact, in some of the events where we're trying to push people to the maximum intensity for a marathon length, we might actually ask them to consume more than 60 grams an hour. Those 30 to 60 grams were really based on the idea that you were trickling in some extra carbohydrate as the glycogen stores were starting to dwindle and needed another carbohydrate source. But it was also based on the idea that because gastric emptying and intestinal absorption of carbohydrate seemed to be about 60 grams per hour max, there was no benefit to taking in extra. More recently, we've found that there are ways to get around that block. We can both train the gut, but also use carbohydrate sources that contain different sorts of carbohydrate forms, which have different intestinal absorption pathways. So if you can put glucose and fructose together, which are absorbed by different transporter mechanisms across the intestine, you can get higher amounts of carbohydrate absorbed. So when you're talking someone like Kipchoge, who's running at a really high intensity, both absolutely and relatively, and you're going to get through all his glycogen and still want to have more carbohydrates supplied to the muscle, 90 grams an hour is a target that we aim for, and that's something that requires a lot of dedication to the training part of things, and that training the gut, but also training the behaviour, because you've got to have an athlete who's able to grab things and consume them on the run or the walk or the ride. So with some of the really higher intensity events that are more than 2 hours, that target might be required. But if you as an athlete think, well, I'm running a marathon and I need to do that, you might have missed some of the subtlety. If you're doing a marathon and you're taking 4.5 to 5 hours to finish, good on you for being able to do the event, but you're not using the same amount of fuel, because the intensity at which you're moving is much lower than Kipchoge. So you might be doing the same, you might even be in the same race as him if you're doing one of the big city marathons that has both the elite and the recreational involved. But for you, that 90 grams an hour is not necessary, because you're just not using fuel that fast because of the pace that you're going at. So 30 to 60 might be more of a target that's matching what your muscles are using. And that's where ultramarathon gets interesting, because there are both races that people can do at really sort of maximal intensities over 4 or 5 or 10 hours. And you might need more than the 30 to 60, just depending on what the total race fuel requirement is and how much you've stored in your muscle. But if you're doing like a 24-hour or 48-hour kind of a really, really ultra race, well, then it's more like probably the 30 to 60 that you sustain over that period that's going to meet your muscle requirements. So it's a lot about knowing what the requirements of your race are and what are your opportunities to meet it in terms of nutritional support, both prior to, in the preparation, and then during.
Yeah. Now, speaking of protein, do you believe, like in some of these really long ultras, say for 24 or 48 hours, it's important to ingest some protein and some fats and that sort of stuff, or should we just be trying to stick purely to carbohydrate?
No, look, I think both in practical forms and in nutritional requirements from the theory of it, that including some protein and some fat is sensible. For a couple of reasons. One is that I think the protein requirement over that long period is important for both the sort of maintenance of the repair that's going on in the muscle and other body requirements for protein. But also in terms of the practical side of things, the flavour fatigue is a real issue. Yeah. If you're just having sticky carbs all the time, you think, oh gosh, not another lemon lime drink that's going to go. And so you do need different flavours and different textures of food. And if you look back to the history of what people do in some of those longer events, think about cycling and as well as the ultramarathons, people have gravitated to being able to use a range of real foods, whole foods, when they exercise. And that's made possible because of the lower intensity of what they're doing. Plus, sometimes the culture of that sport is that it has aid stations or feed zones or handlers or some way in which the athlete gets access along the road to food, or they have the ability to carry it with them. And so you think about cycling. I mean, there's always been a tradition of having jerseys in the back of your or pockets in the back of your jersey so that you can carry things. And cyclists have always taken sandwiches and cakes and real foods out with them. And I think in lots of ultramarathons too, there's that sort of cultural tradition that there's a wider variety of foods that are used. And because people are moving at either a lower intensity or in the case of cycling, it's a much more gentle action of, there's not the joggling up and down of your gut, and there's more opportunity to sort of freewheel on the bike and take your hands off the handlebars and get something to eat. So there's both the tradition and the opportunity to do it. And it's interesting sometimes that we look at what athletes are doing, think that's interesting, why? And then when you see what they're doing, it's almost like they've worked it out for themselves. Yes, it was good to have protein, so that's why you were taking those ham and cheese sandwiches with you.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Now, many ultra runners have gotten into having a low carbohydrate, high fat diet because, because you're moving at a lower intensity, they believe you're using fat as your fuel. I know you've done research on this, and can you maybe share with the listeners what your conclusions on that were and the reasons for that?
Yeah, so we've done quite a bit of research now looking at keto diets. And again, it was based on observing what people are saying that they're doing. And when you get to be as old as I am, one of the interesting things is you see the same messages sort of recycled. So when I was very early in my dietetic career, there was a lot of interest in the keto diet around a study that was published in 1983 by Steve Phinney, in which he showed that you could adapt to being on a low-carb diet. And in his experiment, there was no benefit to performance, but there wasn't the expected detriment to performance that you would have expected based on the glycogen story. And he was able to show that the muscle can retool to double its rate of fat oxidation, even in well-trained athletes who are already better at burning fat than non-exercising people. But we went back, 2015 was our first study, to look at whether that was able to be exploited by athletes in race walking. And so in race walking, there's a 50K event, which takes about 3.5 hours to do. And so that's getting into the territory where it's not going to be possible to store enough glycogen with the preparation. So we need ways of being able to extend fuel stores. And so one route is to be able to take in extra carbs during the race, or the alternative is to become less dependent on carbohydrate altogether and use the keto diet to be able to make the muscle a fat burning machine and therefore try and do the race just based on fat. So we did a number of studies and we found no benefit to performance, and in fact an impairment of performance, because we'd forgotten one of the important factors of physiology and biochemistry, and that is that fat requires more oxygen to produce ATP than does carbohydrate. It's about sort of 5 to 6% difference, which is important if you're moving at higher intensities. So with our race walkers and our studies, we used a 10,000 metre race walking event as our performance measure. And when we're looking at that, athletes are moving at above 80% of VO2 max, and sometimes, sort of closer to 90% of VO2 max. And in those ranges of intensity, it's really important to be efficient with how much ATP you can produce for the amount of oxygen you can deliver to the muscle. And under those circumstances, the ketogenic diet isn't helpful. In fact, it impairs performance because with carbohydrate, you're going to get more ATP for that amount of oxygen that's already sort of at maximum level. If you're doing something at a much lower intensity, if you're doing ultramarathons and it's a consistent effort of sort of 60 to 65% of VO2 max, well, then you probably have capacity to be able to burn fat because you can always increase the amount of oxygen supply to the muscle to burn that fat. It's not limiting. It's interesting then when you get these sort of hybrid events, and when you think of an Ironman event, which goes for long periods of time, but because it's made up of 3 individual legs, the relative intensity of each of the individual legs is higher than just the 8 or 10 hours of the event itself would predict if you're doing it just as a single mode of exercise. But also the tactics in the event need to be taken into account. So if you're able to do an event where you're sort of pacing yourself and it's all steady state at lower intensity, then you could say, yes, there's a potential there that the ketogenic diet would be useful, but particularly if you're in an event where it's difficult to get extra supplies of fuel during the race. If you're doing a self-supported race where you have to carry everything yourself, then it's going to be difficult to keep supplying yourself with the carbohydrates if that's the route that you're going with the muscle fuel use. But if you're doing even a 10-hour event where there's going to be tactics that mean that you need to be able to have higher intensity pieces, then that's where it's going to get tricky to work out whether if you put all your eggs in the fat basket, whether the fat that you're going to have to have in a higher intensity piece, which might be, racing against someone else to get up the hill or to the finish line, you might find that that's where you lose out. And when you look at cyclists who live that life, I mean, when you're doing the Tour de France or when you're doing a single day's road race where it is a 6 to 8 hour event, the peloton might be moving at 60% of VO2 max for a lot of the race, but it's not won by the peloton. It's won by the guy that, that can do the breakaway or sprint to the line. And so in cycling, you find that they do have very high carbohydrate intakes. And there's been some really interesting work that's come out of some of the tours. In fact, I've been watching the Tour de France as we've been over the last couple of weeks, and a number of the teams are tweeting or, giving some information around what they're feeding their riders. And it's very highly carbohydrate based. And, sometimes there's absolutely prodigious amounts of carbohydrate consumed, things that the average person would just be gobsmacked by, because it's truly an amazing feat to both have the intestine absorb it, the muscle use it, and the teams supply it to the athlete in the first place. The range of clever ways in which they can get the fuel to the rider and the rider can consume it and make use of it to get the maillot jaune is just incredible.
Yeah, a lot to learn from all of the cycling, and especially the Tour de France. You've also spoken, I believe, about periodizing between high carbohydrate and low carbohydrate, high fat as maybe an alternative. Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, so this goes back to thinking about what each exercise session is doing and thinking about the way that nutrition can support it best. So if we're dealing with endurance athletes who are doing a mixture of both high volume and high intensity training, there could be some advantages to sometimes having training done with low glycogen availability. So even though we've said that the glycogen is really important to support the muscle's performance, and there are some high quality training sessions an athlete will do that should get that sort of support so the athlete can train with high quality, maybe some of the other sessions that they do, the lower intensity recovery sessions, or the sessions that are done at the beginning of the endurance phase. So when you periodising your training for the year, there's phases of sort of the beginning part where you're just building up the fitness again from the break you've had, and you're doing work that's trying to improve just aerobic capacity. That kind of exercise, when it's done with low glycogen, can amplify the training adaptation, because training with low glycogen means that the signalling pathways in the muscle that are producing some of those adaptations are upregulated. And there may be also some advantages to having periods post-exercise where you don't immediately restore glycogen, so that adaptation phase lasts longer in the post-exercise recovery. So we now have this idea of the periodisation of carbohydrate, having phases where we might deliberately around some sessions of exercise in the week either do it fasted or do it with low glycogen. Now that doesn't need a high fat, low carb diet to achieve that. It's sometimes simply a matter of just putting training sessions together. So if you're doing a very big session in the morning and then not having a lot of carbohydrate between the next session you do in the afternoon, that will mean the second session is done with low glycogen. And so it sometimes is not so much an issue of a lot of dietary change, so much as the way that you schedule the training sessions together. And in fact, when we've done studies and looking at the literature in general, those studies in which...
hang on a second, I just lost you. Keep going.
So just keep talking?
Yeah, all good.
All right, where were we? So if you have a look at the literature in terms of the periodisation of carbohydrate, where clever programs have been put together, where some sessions of the week are done with low carbohydrate availability, so fasted training or the low glycogen training, and where there may be some sessions in which the glycogen isn't restored immediately post-training. When that sort of clever periodisation is done, studies where it's been exploited with sort of lower trained people or athletes of lower caliber generally show that that kind of training is better at producing the adaptations and ultimate performance improvements than the athletes doing the same training, but not all the clever dietary manipulation. However, when we've done those studies, and other people too have done them in elite athletes, we don't find any benefit over just having a high carbohydrate availability approach all the time. And that we think is because the way that elite athletes train with such volume and such intensity all the time is that it's already periodizing glycogen availability. Now, we've had race walkers who do a 40K walk in the morning and then do a 10K walk in the afternoon. Now, I don't care what you eat between those two sessions, that second session will be done with low glycogen. Yeah. And so it's possible that one of the cultural and traditional reasons why athletes train as hard as they do is that does that glycogen periodization. Now, whether we add more to it with our nutrition strategies to amplify it is probably a matter of how hard the athlete's training. And athletes who are lower caliber tend not to be able to absorb the same amount of training. And so for them, maybe those dietary manipulations to add a bit more light and shade to the glycogen story is useful, but at the very high end, maybe it's less useful. I'm not saying that it's not something that we would completely avoid, but it's probably not as useful. The one thing I should say, though, is that these kinds of training manipulations around the carbohydrate availability and the dietary strategies to amplify it, they're all done in a really clever way. And it's not just what some people think when they hear a message of, oh, let's just do it all the time. Let's just hit it with a big stick. So, sometimes we discover something, oh, yes, training with low glycogen amplifies the training response. So then people say, oh, let's just do it all the time. We'll just train with low glycogen all the time. And then they wonder why there's no benefit. And it's because they've just taken one message and not recognised that the whole business of performance is doing different kinds of training, which builds a little part of the piece of what it's required to be an elite athlete. So there's a lot of different attributes and characteristics that make up a good performance. And each of the training sessions that people do is adding a little bit to that component. So trying to just make all your training or all your diet a single flavour is failing to recognise just the complexity of what you need to build together for peak performance.
Yeah, yeah. And I was actually going to ask, what was your opinion on training low, which is also known as fasted running, because and you've given it a little bit there, but then, like you were saying, a lot of runners go, well, if it works, I better go fasted run every time I run. So, and you're saying there's not necessarily any benefit to every morning going, well, I'm not going to eat and I'm just going to run for a couple of hours fasted. It doesn't necessarily work that way.
That's right. You've got to think about things. So some sessions like that, particularly early in the season, might help to amplify that first aerobic capacity building phase. But then you might think, well, gosh, we've already heard that we need to be able to consume carbohydrate during exercise in some events. So you obviously need to train by doing that so that you train your gut and also you train your behavioural capacity. You can't suddenly learn to grab something and eat it or take your hands off the handlebars and get it into your mouth if you haven't practiced it in training. So we've got to think of all the different aspects of what we need to build up and then periodise them at some point into the program. So it might be in the early part of the season, a lot of those early morning runs are done fasted, but as you get closer to a race, you need to start making it more purpose-built for the race that you're doing and, bring in the capacity to be able to consume and utilise the fuel during the session. So I think that's one of the really good reasons that people should be seeing a sports dietitian, to learn all the little intricacies of what's required to build up to that peak performance and learn how to integrate all the different ideas into the program. So you don't want to be a one-trick pony. You want to be somebody that understands what do I have to build together? What's my perfect performance going to look like in terms of the biology and physiology of what I'm doing? and how can I start building all those little components into it in the training phase.
Yep. And yes, that's a good point that athletes, if they're really serious about nailing their nutrition, need to see a sports dietitian. I remember there was always a lot of talk about, a refueling sort of window of opportunity. Is this a real phenomenon or just an old wives' tale?
Look, it's not so much an old wives' tale. It's just another example of when we find some new tidbit, we try and kind of go crazy with it. And, everything's all about what's tweetable and what can be said in 140 characters. And I think, yes, we certainly found that post-exercise, there's a period of time when there can be an amplification of recovery processes. Now, how useful that is for an athlete depends on what the sport is that you're doing and what the goals of the next session are. So if you're playing basketball once a week or doing a park run once a week and maybe a couple of times doing a bit of training during the week, you've got a lot of time of recovery between sessions, and the event that you're doing is not going to, you're not needing to amplify your glycogen stores to get through the session itself. So there's no real need to try and be proactive with recovery to get to the next stage. But if you're playing at Wimbledon, or you're a cyclist in the Tour, or you're doing a couple of sessions or 3 sessions a day as a triathlete, and there is a need for some of those sessions to be able to quickly help you to refuel for the next session, then you've got to use that recovery time really cleverly. So there's not a lot of recovery that occurs in the absence of nutritional support. So if you're thinking about, I need to maximise my fuel stores for the next session, then you need to start eating carbs early so that all the recovery, your time that you've got, becomes a refueling time. If you're thinking about the protein recovery in terms of synthesizing new proteins to either build muscle if you're doing resistance training type work, or if it's recovery of the damaged tissue that you might have occurred in a contact sport or in a sport involving eccentric contractions, or if you're thinking about just building more enzymes and proteins to help with the aerobic pathways, well then that all requires protein substrate to build those new proteins. And so then the recovery message becomes important as well. So we've got to think about what needs to be recovered and how long have I got to do it? Is there a need to be able to be more proactive in it? And sometimes it's not a matter of just shoveling down more food. Sometimes it might be that you're putting your training sessions and your diet together so that when you train, there's a meal coming soon afterwards, and so that you make use of that meal to build those recovery blocks just naturally. One of the things I think that's been a bit of a disadvantage about recovery eating, it became this idea that you had to suddenly quickly shove food into you. And sometimes the type of food that people were choosing wasn't really nutrient dense, and it was convenient and practical, and it might have been easy to consume when you've just done a whole lot of exercise and you're not really feeling hungry. But it often meant that we were filling athletes full of low nutrient density food that they really didn't need. And I often laughed when my son was small and we'd go to swimming carnivals. I mean, you still see it now, that a swimmer will go and swim a 100-metre race, and then they'll get out of the water and they'll go straight to the bag of lollies and eat 200 grams of lollies because they need to refuel. And it bears no resemblance to the requirement of the session they've just done, or the fact that they might have one more swim a couple of hours later. We've got to think about nutrition in the bigger picture rather than just take that simple message and oversimplify it.
Yeah. No, just changing tack a bit. There's where I wanted to talk about iron and iron deficiency, and I read that you've said that iron deficiency in athlete populations remains a common issue. Why is this, and what do iron stores mean for athletes?
Well, iron's a really important nutrient because there's different functions it has in the body. We think of it a lot as being part of the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood through hemoglobin, but also into the muscle through myoglobin. And iron's also involved in a lot of the metabolic processes. It's a coenzyme, or involved in enzymes that are important in those reactions. So an athlete who has low iron status may have suboptimal ability to deliver oxygen, and we've already talked about how important oxygen is as part of the fuel burning process. We certainly don't want athletes being anemic, but probably at the beginning of my career in the 90s, we were beginning to realise that we could measure iron stores in the athlete through ferritin measurements, which gave us some sort of insight into how much reserve the athlete had in terms of their iron. So we want to keep hemoglobin levels up high, but we also want to have some storage iron available, so that as the athlete is using more iron than the average person, and they do that because they're continually breaking down red blood cells, or using and needing to recycle some of the iron stores in their body. And one of the interesting things we found more recently is that the ability to do that, which is somewhat under the control of a hormone called hepcidin, is impaired in athletes. When we exercise, there's a period of time during and post-exercise that this hepcidin hormone is increased, and its effect is to reduce our ability to absorb iron in our diet, or to recycle the iron that's been released because we've done damaged red blood cells, and we've liberated the iron that was in those red blood cells. And normally we'd recycle a lot of that. But when hepcidin levels are high, that's an impaired process. So athletes are needing more iron, but they're also having an inability to absorb some of the iron that they're consuming at different times of the day because of the interaction of exercise and this hepcidin hormone. So what we're now really interested in teaching athletes to do is to increase the absorbable iron in their diet through their dietary choices, but also to think about when they're having it during the day in relation to exercise, so that it's not a wasted effort. You know, it's a shame to be eating the iron that you need, but they're not being able to absorb it well. And that goes for the iron supplements that athletes might need to take as well on occasion. Sometimes we need to prevent or treat iron deficiency by using iron supplements. And sometimes when athletes are going to, say, altitude training, where we know there's going to be a requirement to use more iron to make the most of that altitude training event, we supplement them with some extra iron going into that and during the event, or during the altitude training, so that they can maximise their adaptation to the training. So whether it's with the iron supplements or whether it's with the iron-rich meals that athletes are consuming, we've got now clever ways of trying to put it into the day so that it's not in that period post-exercise, the sort of 3 to 5 hours post-exercise, where there's some impairment of absorption. We try and organise things so that the iron that's in the diet's consumed at a time that it can be absorbed well. And we also think about the mix and match of nutrients. So there are different other elements in our diet that can either assist or impair iron absorption. We know that the phytate in fibre and calcium inhibit iron absorption, but the vitamin C and presence of meat or animal protein at a meal increases iron absorption. So by helping athletes put their meals together to mix and match some of these factors that enhance iron absorption, we can help athletes get a better result in terms of the iron that's actually available into the body.
Yep. And would you say, I'm gathering that you're saying also that it's better to get your iron from food rather than supplements, although you can use supplements, but it is better?
Yeah, so we would try and get with the food first process about every aspect of diet, that there's benefits from getting our nutrients from food, but there are times that an athlete might need to have the support of iron supplements, either to quickly reverse iron deficiency, or in the case of things like altitude training, ensure that they've got adequate iron to make sure they maximise the benefits of the training that they're doing.
Yeah.
But one of the really important things that athletes should do is to get their iron status measured rather than just assuming that they know what they're feeling. I mean, a lot of athletes think, oh, I'm feeling a bit tired. I'm probably iron deficient. I'll just have a couple of, I'll just take a couple of iron supplements to treat that. And they may be completely missing the mark that there are other reasons that they're tired, but they're also not using iron supplements in the best way possible. So it sounds easy because you can buy iron over the counter, that you can just treat yourself, but this is one of the areas that really needs good input from a sports physician to be able to get the iron measured, and then the dietitian's input to help people know how to both get the food first thing working well, as well as knowing when to take the iron if it's needed to be taken.
Because there is problems with taking too much iron, isn't there?
Yes, look, there's two aspects to that. There's one is when it's unnecessary and it's masking another problem that the athlete should be looking into. Sometimes there's, people aren't getting enough sleep, or they're not getting enough carbohydrate, or there's some other reason for that, and just simply taking the iron tablets, completely missing the real problem. But you can overdose on iron, and you can also miss the chance to diagnose a sort of a nasty cause of iron loss. Sometimes people have got ulcers, gastric ulcers, or sometimes they're losing blood from other parts of their body, and they may be putting the Band-Aid on it in putting extra iron in from the supplements to try and match the iron losses, but they're not getting to the underlying problem. And so sometimes, people then get themselves into a real problem that the underlying cause of the iron loss just wasn't being managed, and it will lead to a medical event that's much more severe than it needed to be.
Yeah, fair enough. Now, going back to what you said earlier when we first started talking about, you did some studies on having protein across the day. That really interests me. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes, so there was a lot of interest, particularly from Stu Phillips' work, showing that post-exercise protein is a really important part of maximising the response to exercise. And it was first discovered in terms of resistance exercise, but has also the same message around endurance exercise or any of the exercise that an athlete does. It amplifies the synthetic pathways for protein, and the kind of proteins that you build then based on the type of exercise that you're doing. Your body's remarkable at being able to say, right, I need more of this protein versus that protein, depending on the exercise stimulus. But providing the protein post-exercise to amplify that response is important. So there's then this idea, well, when's the best time to eat the protein? We certainly know post-exercise is useful, but because each session of exercise can amplify protein synthetic responses for about 24 hours, there's a good window to say, well, I can get the first post-exercise protein synthesis happening immediately, but when else should I be trying to get value for that session I've done? If I've got 24 hours that I can exploit to benefit from it, when should I be eating next time? And so we did a study that compared the idea of eating 3 square meals where you have protein sort of at separate times of the day, but 6 hours apart, and a big version of it, versus having a little nibbling approach where you're having little amounts of protein all throughout the day, versus having these sort of, a substantial amount of protein, but not a bucketful of protein. So we looked at eating the same amount of protein, but spreading it in different ways with different amounts. And we found that in terms of the overall protein synthesis response, that having these periods of sort of a 20-gram protein bolus every sort of 3 to 4 hours was the most efficient way of being able to use the response from the single exercise session. Now, that 20 grams of protein needs to be thought of. We did it in a very simple way, that the athlete was just consuming protein at that time. And we know that the important part of the protein delivery is that we need to eat enough protein to get our leucine levels in the blood to a threshold. And when you just have something that's a very simple protein meal, so particularly a liquid form of it, where it's consumed and it's absorbed really quickly, the response in the blood of the amino acid, particularly the leucine, is very, very rapid. If you have the same food or same amount of protein in food form, it's a much slower absorption rate because there's more food, there's fibre, there's fat that slow down the rate of the absorption of the protein. So we now sort of scale that and say that if you're thinking about the amount of protein that you're consuming, certainly a target of that 20 grams is appropriate if it's just as protein in liquid form. But if you're eating a big meal, you might need to eat 30 or 40 grams of protein to get the same amount of increase in leucine, just taking into account that the meal has a much more sort of flattened response of the amino acid absorption. So I guess what we're telling people these days is spreading protein over the day more equally is important. And for most people, practically, that means trying to make breakfast and lunch a bigger protein meal and having something post-exercise. It's a good protein source. Most of us eat enough protein full stop, but we tend to have not much for breakfast, a little bit for lunch, and then a cow for dinner. And so it's very unequally distributed. If we get people to sort of not back end their day so much with protein, but distribute it more equally at their meals and at a post-exercise recovery opportunity, then that's the most efficient way of being able to get the benefit of exercise in terms of protein synthesis.
Excellent. We've sort of touched on a few of them, like diets like keto, but there's also, veganism or vegetarianism. What is the best diet for endurance athletes? Is it focusing on one of those sorts of diets or just in general?
Look, I think there's many ways to get to the same end. I think the idea of being able to periodize carbohydrate to be able to get high quality protein, they're philosophies that can be met through different food styles. And so you can eat a vegetarian or vegan diet. It's a bit more difficult to particularly meet the protein requirements with that, but you can, particularly if you see a sports dietitian, learn how to choose the foods that are going to achieve those philosophies. You can eat it with a more what we call an omnivore diet, eating a larger range of foods. I'm particularly not my own personal view, is that the more different foods that you include in your diet, the more easily you can meet all your requirements, and it makes your life a bit more streamlined too, because you've got the whole food supply available to you. When you start to restrict food intake from different food groups, then you make it a bit more difficult to get what you need. It's not impossible, but it just requires a greater sort of commitment from you. Now, I really admire people who are vegans and vegetarians who do this because of either religious beliefs or because of their commitment to the sustainability and animal welfare. And so that's a really good reason for choosing that lifestyle. But if I meet an athlete and they said they've gone vegan and you say, why is that? And they say, oh, because some famous movie star's done it. And when you listen to what they're eating, they're just, eating a really poorly chosen diet and buying a few vegan powders and whatever. That's not the commitment that's required to do the best job. And it's not a good look for veganism either to be doing it so poorly. So I would suggest that there'd be ways in which that person could either improve the way they're following a vegan diet or consider going back to a wider range of foods, but having meals that include the vegan philosophy so that they're doing it well for those portions of their week or day, but being able to eat a wider range of foods if that's more sustainable in terms of what their lifestyle commitment can allow.
Yep, fair enough. Now, if an athlete is listening to this and thinking, well, I'd like to go and see a sports dietitian, how would they go about finding like a really good one?
Well, there's a great tool on the Sports Dietitians Australia website. It's called Find a Sports Dietitian. And so you can go in and type your location, and then you'll find the list of sports dietitians that are available in your area. And there's also some information about those dietitians that might suggest that they have particular areas of expertise. Like, even though we're all involved in sport, there are some people who specialise more in working with team sports or maybe working with vegans. If I wanted to learn more about how to look after someone who's got gastrointestinal challenges around their sport, being able to eat and feel comfortable around it, then there are dietitians who specialise in that. So the sports dietitians website's a great way of sort of just finding both the location and the specialised expertise of sports dietitians that might meet with your particular challenges.
All right. Well, I'll put the link to that website in the show notes so listeners can have a look there. Thank you so much, Louise, for coming on the podcast today and sharing such wonderful information. I know the listeners will have found it really, really helpful.
Terrific. Thanks for inviting me.
No worries. Thank you. Bye.